This is Unit 8A, Art and Science, well, Project A of Unit 8. So the basics is that it's a combination of art and science and how it presents in the world and how artists refuse that they are separate things. And I'm going to look at it in a much more animation perspective eventually. So started with a mind map, which I talked about the basics of art and science as an experiment in terms of the areas of science, biology, chemistry, physics, and then I looked into astronomy and technology and the evolution of technology over time and how it allowed us to animate. And I've got a mood board full of images relevant to the topics and ideas I've got. For the first artist, I looked at Pegbarians, which is a small Dutch animation team based on YouTube. They make small cartoon animations using the software TV Paint, and they upload them to YouTube and Tumblr. As a response to Pegbarians, I first started by doing some little drawings of 2 of their characters. I then took it further by developing them into my own characters for an initial idea that I have, which is to make a comic book about 2 scientists doing experiments. Next, I looked at Gerald Scarfe, who was a political cartoonist known for drawings and paintings of figures such as Boris Johnson. For a miniature response, I did an observational drawing of one of his works, and then as a proper response, I decided to draw the 3 main political leaders of today, and then I uploaded them onto Photoshop by scanning them, and I gave them a colour scheme similar to the paint that Gerald Scarfe uses. The third artist I decided to look at was Roy Lichtenstein, who makes pop art in the form of comic strips. They're very popular artworks, and in response, I took the character designs I did from the Pegbarian response. I decided to give them a Lichtenstein style filter in Photoshop. I then proceeded to make a comic strip image in the style of Roy Lichtenstein's work. For my initial ideas, it was to make a small comic strip of a scientist performing an experiment in a laboratory, and that was hence with the drawing of Dr. Jekyll Eisenhower, who was a character I created pretty much off the top of my head, really. And in regards to the science stuff, we had a trip to London and we participated in a spray paint workshop in which I produced a stencil of a chemistry set, well, test tube, some bubbles, and a fire. Concept 1 developed this a bit further by deciding to go with art forgery in a comic strip to give it much more of a narrative. So I looked at art forging for contextual research. And then for the actual character designs, I drew them up several times with different materials such as pencil, biro pen, charcoal, and fine liner. And I also drew up some basic storyboards for an idea as to how it was going to go. Then I experimented with charcoals as well to see how that would turn out. They didn't turn out too well, but they look okay. After that, I worked with silk painting and thermocratic paint, which thermocratic basically changes its colour based on heat applied to it. And then I have a series of images of that in effect. For concept 2, it's a development of concept 1 in the form that I was going to decide to make an animated cartoon of the forge, which is the name I gave it. So with this first bit, it's a cyanotype, self-developed photograph via the use of acetate. It turned out quite well. Then I took to Adobe Photoshop and drew up some detailed character designs and gave them different stances ready for making an animation. Then I decided to create some basic GIFs to actually show some animation being done. I did these in Adobe Photoshop and Adobe Fireworks by utilizing frame-by-frame animating. Then with the life drawing, it was more about my experimentation with different styles in comparison to actual on theme. Like these first ones focus on the use of charcoals and chalks for tone, and then we added backgrounds to emphasize the charcoal. Then the second week focused with chalk utilizing negative space by not drawing the life drawing model. These turned out especially well. Concept 3 moves away from the first 2 concepts, but also stays with them. And by this I mean I started looking at digital reality versus our own reality and how we present ourselves in a digital world. So for that I looked at different forms of digital representation, mainly amongst video games and social media, such as character creators and character introductions. With that I went on to look at Borderlands 2, which is a video game made by Gearbox Software and published by 2K Entertainment. It's the story of 4 characters, but throughout the game, main characters that are introduced are all presented with a little introduction. And whilst experimenting with the graphics tablet, I accidentally created a piece that kind of looks like it's in the style of the Borderlands art. Then to take it further, I went to look at how I could use it in different ways. So I took profile portrait pictures of myself on a multitude of angles, and then took them into Photoshop and edited them. I also then experimented with cell shading to see how that would turn out, and it actually turned out quite well. And then I started blending it with myself, my real self. And then I took it even further by taking it into Photoshop again and animating it to blink and even smirk. For my final piece I had a picture of me standing, taken with my arms out, and then I took it into Photoshop and edited it into a Borderlands style character introduction. And then I have my evaluation, which mentions the basics of how my project evolved over the duration of it. For Unit 8B, it was still focused on art and science, but this time I wanted to take on what I'd done in Project A and develop it much further. So I started straight away by looking at webcomics and how they are published online instead of actually in a physical form to help spread them more equally. I then proceeded to actually make the Forge as a webcomic by utilizing Adobe Photoshop and redrawing everything from scratch with a graphics tablet. This final image is the full webcomic in its full form. After that I asked students and teachers to give me feedback on its appearance. And based on the feedback I was told to give more narrative. And I did. I went in and made it so that instead of just forging a random piece, they were forging a piece done by Roy Lichtenstein, one of the artists I researched in Project A. And there's the full version 2 of the webcomic. And then I went on to look at Flash animation, which uses software such as Adobe Flash. What it basically does is it creates an animation that's a lot smoother than standard animation by choosing a frame per second to play it back by. And it uses stuff such as motion tweens to actually do the coding for you. So you simply drag and drop where you want them to be at the right frame, and the software can predict the rest, and you can customize it throughout. Seeing as this was my first time using Adobe Flash, I had to look up a short tutorial online and to see how to use it. I then proceeded to make step-by-step screenshots to show the process I went through to create this first animation, which was just Dr. Glitterbottom walking across the screen. With the success of this animation, I'm going to revisit my concept too, and that was to make an animated cartoon of the Forge. In scene 1, I had to animate both characters moving into center stage, and then I had to make a speech bubble move into place. These were done with motion tweens based on keyframes within the timeline. I had to import the characters from Photoshop and then convert them to graphic symbols to allow the motion tweens to work. In scene 2, I needed to animate so that Dr. Glitterbottom moved across the screen first, and then the Professor ran back across the screen the other way. This again used motion tweens for both of the character movements. In scene 3, I had to animate Dr. Glitterbottom several times to make him climb the ladder to the Forge. I also had to animate the speech bubble to come in separately and then move in line with the Doctor. In scene 4, I had to animate the Wham painting through the pipeline of the Forge. This scene takes inspiration from old cartoons that typically have an evil scientist that has their own laboratory with a large system of pipes for something to pass through them. In scene 5, Wham enters the Forge and explodes upon contact with the fire, engulfing Dr. Glitterbottom. For this scene, I had to animate Wham enter the fire, and then I had to animate the explosion of the word bang, which is onomatopoeia, to cover the entire screen. In scene 6, Dr. Glitterbottom waves his hand around to put out the fire in it. He and the professor then stand and sit in shock as the failure of their grand forge. For this scene, I had to animate the Doctor's hand to be waved around for a few seconds as a separate animation, and then have him transition into just being left with a burnt hand. And then after that, I had to transfer all of it into Adobe After Effects, where I had trouble putting it all together because I didn't actually understand the software, for it was also my first time using After Effects. However, after I'd finally figured it all out and did it correctly, I think it all turned out very well. Then I decided to look at rotoscoping, which is an animation technique in which animators trace over footage frame by frame for use in live action and animated films. So basically what this means is, in live action it is done frame by frame, and you draw over and colour it in with techniques such as cell shading. I proceeded to do something with that, similar to based on my final piece from Project 8A, and then I took it further and developed it into a project of self versus self. And who am I, and what do I mean, and how do I represent myself? Then I looked at putting myself on different textures to see how it would look, such as cardboard and brick walls. Again, my self versus self theme comes in there. Then on this piece with the billboard, I actually collaborated with fellow student Al to create a larger image based on both of our techniques and skills put together. I then took that image and photoshopped it into different landscapes based on feedback to areas such as Route 66. Then I also went back and edited those self-portrait images and gave them much more detail and much more self-shading. I also created a silhouette version with the contrasting colours. And that is Unit 8B so far.